Hello everyone and welcome to the RAF Museum. Thank you for joining us today for a very exciting lecture from Bill Pyke here, who's going to be talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis and as it pertained to what was happening in the United Kingdom as well. I may have butchered your talk somewhat there with that introduction, but I'm sure it will become clear soon. Yeah. So Bill is an independent air power researcher who is focused on the role of the RAF in air intelligence and reconnaissance during the early years of the Cold War. Bill completed an MA in Air Power Studies at the University of Birmingham in 2016 under the guidance of Air Commodore Peter Gray. He has subsequently published in the RAF's Air Power Review and has previously given a lecture here at the RAF Cosford Museum in
2018.
2018. And that was on the role of Marshal of the Royal Air Force, Sir John Slessor.
Chief Marshal.
In establishing Britain's independent airborne nuclear deterrent. So very apt to be talking here, where we've got all three V-bombers together. So I'll hand you over to Bill now. And
before we start, can we get a bit more volume at the back? Everything else feels the same. It's very, very low level at the back here.
Can we sort that, Steve?
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, Bill, over to you then.
Okay. Well, welcome to Cosford, and very happy to see as many people here as we've got, and to the people that might be watching this either now or later on Crowdcast. It's hard to realise that I was supposed to give this lecture nearly 2.5 years ago, Friday, the 20th of March, 2020, just 3 days before the COVID lockdown. And I was strongly advised at that time not to come because of all the restrictions and so on and so forth. So, at that time, of course, I'd have given the lecture, given the talk I'm going to give today with some variations, but it's a long way from the Cold War back in the day, middle of the last century discussion I might have had with what is relevant today, particularly with the Ukrainian war in progress. The potential relevance and comparisons go unabated, either on television or in discussions in various conferences that are going on right now. Today, 28th of October, marks the 60th anniversary of the conclusion of the Cuban Missile Crisis. On that day, the world breathed a huge sigh of relief after a fortnight during which the fate of human civilization hung in the balance. Finally, before we start the slides, some of us, in fact looking around the room, perhaps more than some of us, have personal experience of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I myself was a 15-year-old schoolboy at the time in my GCE O-level year, wondering whether it was all worth it during those previous 2 weeks. So I'll get on with the PowerPoint slides. I've got about 25 of these slides, but I want to concentrate on talking to you and using the slides really just as a prop to illustrate what I'm trying to say. So let's get on with that and look at the setup of the talk that I've got ready for you. Essentially, it comes in 3 parts, the discussion. First of all, not all of you will be aware of the Cuba crisis in the context of how it all developed, how it became a crisis, and what it meant for us here in the United Kingdom. So that'll be the second bit of the talk, which will roll out like this. Causes of the crisis, and we have to go some way back in history before the Cuba crisis to really appreciate what was going on. The American political reaction and strategy, of course, is well expressed, not just by me, but by many people who have given that discussion, particularly in this lecture theatre over the years, in that. But I want to vary the theme a little bit and concentrate on what it all meant for us. I certainly knew what it meant for me. It was a really frightening experience for a 15-year-old. In fact, for anybody that was really aware of what was really going on. So, our vulnerability, and I'll get into this in the course of discussions, against the real possibility of a Soviet nuclear attack, either by missiles or by jet bombers. We look back at it, of course, and we live one day at a time in the present, but we look back in history through a very long lens telescope, and we can see why these things happened and how they happened in a much clearer way than we knew when we were living through it. Learning outcomes, of course, is part of that. Well, there's many things I could say about how we all got to this crisis in the first place. I would start from the year 1955, and then there was a conference. In fact, it was a summit conference held in Vienna in the middle of that year, and it was hopeful that we would finally get something like peaceful coexistence between the communist bloc and the West and the unaligned countries of the world. But more specifically, in looking at Cuba, we have to realize several things. First of all, the revolution in Cuba, which overthrew a rather corrupt person called Batista in 1959. He had links with the mafia, gambling casinos, prostitution, and a whole range of other things. So he was overthrown by the Castro brothers and Che Guevara, essentially. And then that world changed into a communist outpost in the middle of a capitalist arena, particularly in the Western hemisphere. So that's the first thing that really happened. Eisenhower, President Eisenhower that is, had tried to conduct some kind of counter-revolutionary approach to retaining some kind of model of a more peaceable, acceptable person to the Americans to be put in place of Castro. In other words, to decapitate Castro's, not himself, but his approach to what was going on in Cuba. So President Kennedy, a young man in his 40s, inherited Eisenhower's idea of doing this, very much fostered by the CIA, the intelligence agency in the United States, with the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion, which took place in April of that year. And it was a terrible mistake. Something that in his first few months of being president, Kennedy realized that he was badly advised by the so-called experts, military and intelligence. Well, things didn't get any better, and Kennedy met later in the year, I think it was June, yes it was June, 1961. It was a disastrous summit. Khrushchev really belittled Kennedy. He looked at Kennedy as a playboy dilettante. He looked at him as an inexperienced, not very bright with the world person in comparison with himself, who was a commissar at Stalingrad, had seen a lot of war and carnage up close, lost his oldest son, who was in the Air Force during that war. Well, that belittles Kennedy too much, because Kennedy himself was in the US Navy in that same period. But this didn't stop the arrogance, if you like, and the awful rhetoric that took place at the Vienna summit. He felt, Kennedy that is, felt he'd been through a ringer with this particular experience. Later that year, and you can see I've put crises, that's the plural obviously, in Berlin. Berlin was always the contentious point in the Cold War at this point. We'd had the airlift in the late 1940s, we'd had strikes in Berlin and in East Germany. Before that time, it was a serious point and a bone of contention for both sides. So Berlin is a focal point that I'd ask you to come back and think about when we talk about this later in the discussion. Well, the first thing that happened is they put up the Berlin Wall in August 1961, which was a very, very unpopular move and seen by Kennedy as a real serious raising of the game in terms of the way the Berlin crisis was enveloping. In truth, it was put up to stop East Germans getting out of East Germany. It was basically trying to block, Ulbricht being the guy in charge of East Germany at that time, to stop people actually going to the West. But it was a very, very ugly time for both the Americans and, of course, the Germans themselves. The other thing that happened later in the year was an incident at Checkpoint Charlie, which any of you who've been to Berlin will know that it's the exit point from the US sector in the west of Berlin into the Soviet sector. What happened was a range of tanks, US, lined up against Russian tanks, and there was a face-off there, a standoff, if you like, that occurred over a few hours, which was extremely tense and which many people felt could have sparked or ignited a regional and maybe even a nuclear escalation. So things were not looking good at that time in the Cold War, this 45-year war or so that went on. This was probably getting colder and colder as we get to the missile crisis that occurred. In the meantime, the Americans were developing nuclear missiles. Not only that, the delivery systems for them. And they were getting smart at that after some disastrous launches of failed missiles in the mid-50s. By the late 50s, they were actually building missiles that actually worked and worked in anger. And they deployed them, both here in the UK, over in Turkey, and in Italy. Between those years, you can see on the slide, between 1958 and 1961. Well, I'll scan through some of these particular slides and talk about what they all mean. The National Security Agency was never too happy about what was going on in Cuba and started to become suspicious about what the Soviets were actually doing there. The Soviets, for their part, claimed that they were giving help to the Castro regime with farm implements and agricultural machinery. Far from the truth, of course. I'll ask you to remember 3 or 4 words, Russian words, that I'm going to come out with in the next few slides. Maskorivka is one of them, dacha, which you probably already know, and andania. I'll talk about them, and each of them I'll talk about in detail as to how it all worked for this particular this particular episode. So there you can see on the lower part of the slide a U-2. Flying at about 50,000 feet, well out of the range of pretty much everything, it took pictures. And some of you may be able to see, it's very hard, in the top of the slide there, in the top figure there, you can see the word missiles. This was the first time that the Americans realized this on Sunday, the 14th of October of that year, realized that the Russians had moved in, the Soviets rather, had moved in missiles of an offensive nature. That is, they weren't for the protection of Cuba, they were missiles that could be used in an attack on the United States. That's the first thing to remember. And of course, this is what raised the game, the escalation, if you like, of what happened later. Well, about a week later, the Americans got canny at all of this. They continued with the U-2 flights, and they took pictures, these taken with US Navy Crusader aircraft, particularly built around reconnaissance, flying at a speed of nearly 500 miles an hour, and at a height of about 500 feet, being shot at the same time as they took these pictures, got even more detail that you can see there specifically. It almost looks like snow on that right-hand side. It isn't, of course, it's Cuba. But the missile tents, all the oxygen tanks there on the right-hand side of the right-hand side slide, missile erectors, these things were all pointing to the fact that these things were arriving and arriving in force on the island of Cuba. Now, the word maskirovka really means deception. It's a Russian word, obviously, and deception is what the Russians were doing here. They were pretending one thing, farm implements and the like, and in reality, getting offensive missiles into Cuba in volume, maybe 60, maybe 70 of these things. So we had a whole range of these things coming in to Cuba through those particular months between June and September of 1962. And then the U-2s started to find out what was really going on. In truth, the Americans were pretty slow off the mark. They weren't reacting as fast as they could. They had something called HUMINT. HUMINT is human intelligence, by the way. In Cuba, they just weren't believing how important these particular movements were at the time. But certainly they got into gear very, very rapidly in these critical weeks of October 62. So let's look at the sorts of missiles and styles. I don't want to get too much into the involvement of what they are, just to describe what they are and what they would do. So I've got a selection of them here. That's the SS-4, a NATO code name, Sandal. SS means surface to surface, by the way. There's nothing too fancy about that. And the bigger sister, if you like, the Skian, which an SS-5. Now, interestingly, and there's a little bit of an aside here, the British had a major contribution to make in understanding these weapons. They knew because they were running an agent called Oleg Penkovsky. MI6 was running him for about a year and a half. Penkovsky was disillusioned. He was a colonel in the intelligence services in Russia, and he was feeding a businessman, Greville Wynne, in Moscow with details of both of those missiles and more. So the British, I was going to say we, but the British passed on this information to the Americans. After all, there's a close relationship between the both intelligence services. And what they realized is these missiles were fairly dangerous and fairly effective in their launching and in their accuracy. So Penkovsky was passing this information on to Greville Wynne, to MI6, obviously in London, and then into Washington with the CIA and so forth. The Americans then realized how dangerous they were, how accurate. They knew the yield, the range, the navigation aids, the gyroscopes, and all the rest of it, and how they would proceed to activating these particular missiles should they ever be put into use. So by daily overflights, dangerous at many times, they were learning a lot about what was going on. Well, let's move on with some of them. There's always something called the unknown unknowns. Well, these were unknown unknowns to the Americans almost until the end of the conflict. Not only were the Russians, the Soviets providing these strategic missiles, the Sandal and Skian, but also tactical ones. Tactical, what does that mean? They're all nuclear weapons. They're all terribly destructive. But tactical would be used at the battlefield level. So, for instance, if Cuba was to be invaded, these are the sorts of missiles that they'd be looking at. This first one looks very crude by today's eyes. It looks like an old MiG-15 that's been modified to act as a cruise missile. And these were moved into position near Guantanamo Bay in the southeast part of Cuba to be used to destroy the US Marine Corps base there should the balloon go up. The other one is called, the NATO people called it a frog, but the Russians themselves called it the Luna, was very much a missile based on German technology of the V2 variety of the Second World War, called the Luna. These things, or Moon, these things had a range of about 20 or 30 kilometers, very local in their use. Finally, they had bombers, jet bombers that they were putting into effect, which could also carry nuclear weapons, these ones medium-range nuclear weapons. And finally, the only thing the Americans would accept are the SA missiles. These are the guideline missiles. that were used, SAM missiles that were used to defend the island. That was acceptable to the Americans. Everything else was absolutely not. Just for point of reference, those are the missiles, several of them were fired on Gary Power's U-2 that was flying over Russia in May 1960. So, back to that old word, Mariskuvka. This is what they were doing. They were moving these things by ship. 40,000 military personnel. The Americans never knew this until the end of the Cold War, but as many as 40,000 troops were being moved onto the island, Soviet troops that is, together with the missions materiel, aircraft and missiles and so forth, over a period of about 3 or 4 months. This was a huge deception, a huge deception. The Americans asked the Russians, the Soviets, are you moving offensive missiles, are you moving offensive bombers into Cuba? And they denied it right the way through. So the first thing they were doing was lying. The second thing for the Russians they were doing was confusing their own people, the Soviets particularly. Apologies for keep calling them Russians, but essentially they were essentially mostly Russian, but certainly Soviet in that area. But in that time, they were moving all these troops, and they thought they were going to an Arctic place. It was called Operation Anadyr. Anadyr is a river that drains into the Bering Straits in northeast Siberia. Anadyr was supposed to put them off the scent. Anyone that was leaking information to the West, i.e. to intelligence services, that they had no intention of going to the Caribbean. In reality, they were going to the Caribbean. 40,000 of them below deck during the day and above deck only at night time when reconnaissance aircraft or ships in the area of American flags were in operation. It was hot, and a lot of them complained about the horrendous conditions that they were in, baked in these things as they came across to this Caribbean island. So we get this whole thing, and there to give you a map and the shock that it gave to the Americans particularly, not so much of the SS-4s, you can see there in the red thing, I'll just point over to it. These are the shorter range missile areas. Of course, you know, Panama and all the rest of it wouldn't have been what they were looking at. It would have been genuinely the military bases of the United States in the southern eastern states of the US. The bigger threat, of course, is with the Skian, which had a range that almost got every major city in the US with the possible exception of San Francisco. So this was really quite alarming to the Americans. I might add at this point that the Russians already had missiles on their submarines that could have done much the same job. But that wasn't necessarily the point, and we'll come into that later when we talk about how Kennedy dealt with it. Well, here we come to a very interesting part of the discussions, and this one took place 3 days after they had decided that there was a very serious crisis developing. What you're seeing there are the JCS, as they call them, the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States. These guys are the high priests, if you like. You don't get higher. They're the brass hats. They're the guys that really call the shots. And to a man, I emphasize that, they were absolutely, first of all, against the Soviets, and second, they were against Kennedy. They never liked him. They thought he was a dilettante. They thought he was a womanizer, and they thought he wasn't for the United States. He really came under the cosh of a lot of prejudice from those people. Just to the left of Kennedy, who you can see there in his armchair there, the rocking chair rather, is a guy called Curtis LeMay. Now Curtis LeMay, that is, was the chief of the United States Air Force Strategic Air Command. So he had a lot of vested interest. And in fact, at an earlier stage of his career, together with his colleagues, they felt they should have had a preventive strike on the Soviet Union before the Soviet Unions even got nuclear weapons. So we're speaking here of a very much strange love situation, something that needs to be borne in mind when we look at the tensions within the senior echelons and ranks of the Air Force, the Army, the Marines, and the Navy, and of course the ExCom, the committee of people, of politicians and others, advisors, that were advising Kennedy on what to do. So let me, not with an American accent, I'm not going to do that. I've lived in the States, but I'm not going to do that. Here's General LeMay, comes from the Midwest. I'm not going to do a Midwest accent. If we don't do anything to Cuba, then they're going to push us on Berlin. We mentioned that before. Push real hard because they've got us on the run. This blockade and political action I see leading to war. This is almost as bad as appeasement at Munich. I don't see any other solution other than direct military action right now. A blockade and political talk would be considered by a lot of our friends and neutrals as a lot of nonsense. You're in a pretty bad fix, Mr. President. The President. What did you say? You're in a pretty bad fix. The President. You're in there with me. So it just shows you the detachment of the military and the political wing of the government at that time. Kennedy left the room. All this, by the way, was recorded, which for posterity is wonderful for historians like myself and others to know that this stuff actually exists on tape as well. All this stuff was taped. This bit wasn't, though. He left the room. This is Kennedy left the room with his brother Bobby, who was the Attorney General. He said, "These brass hats have one great advantage in their favor. If we listen to them and do what they want us to do, none of us will be alive later to tell them how wrong they were." So there's something in that too. So you can get the feeling of what was going on in these tense 2 weeks between the discovery of what had occurred and what was actually going to happen. Well, what could happen? Let's look at these scenarios. We've already addressed some of them. Do nothing. I don't think that's even a starter. Invade Cuba. What? Invade Cuba? So you're going to kill some Soviets at the same time, get hold of their nuclear weapons, which haven't been loosed off. That doesn't look like a good idea either. Surgical strikes. I love this word, surgical strike. There's no such thing as a surgical strike when you're attacking areas like this. It's quite a populous island, Cuba. Surgical strikes would not be that surgical. They would take out the missiles perhaps, but probably not all of them. And that was the uncertainty that you had to deal with there. Finally, a maritime blockade of dubious legality in international maritime law, but be advised, they were looking at this as a potential war, in which case they saw emergency powers that had to be put into place. So let's look at the scenery here. Always nice to have a bit of geography on the presentation to show what was going on. This line is 500 miles from Havana, going right the way around to, of course, the Central American states. But essentially, it's all about Florida as much as anything else, and trying to have basically a quarantine area that the American forces, particularly the Navy, obviously, would police that entire area and prevent Russian ships from getting anywhere near Cuba. How would the Russians or the Soviets see this? Not very well, but actually on the Russian side, on the Soviet side, they were quite relieved that that's all that was really being talked about at the time. Well, we'll come back to that, not this slide, but to discuss some of the things that happen on that. Here's a ship heading towards Cuba, and it has, as you can possibly see, those horizontal lines there are missiles, crated missiles, that is, on their way. They're probably the Skian variety, the slightly larger ones that are coming, and it's coming close to the quarantine line. This is 800 kilometers, so it's getting close, 500 miles anyway, to where we're really talking about. Kazimov was coming. Kennedy had decided to prescribe this quarantine on the 22nd of October, and then on the 23rd you've got this ship sailing towards it. Well, Khrushchev on that same day sent a message by teletype. There was no way they could communicate by phone at that time or by any other direct message. So the teletype wrote this when it was translated. And he writes in more or less the narrative of a parable. He says, if people do not show wisdom, then in the final analysis it will come to a clash, like blind moles, and then reciprocal extermination will begin. Let us therefore show statesmanlike wisdom. I propose we, for our part, will declare that our ships bound for Cuba are not carrying any kind of armaments. Another lie on Marskovka. So you can see the way this was all really headed towards deeper crisis. Kennedy wasn't going to buy any of that, and surely his chiefs of staff, his JCS, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, would not put up with that either. This is a lovely cartoon, and by the way, take pride it was done in Britain. This one is done by a guy called Leslie Illingworth. Now, Leslie Illingworth, a Welshman by background, was a political cartoonist in the 50s, and this was published a couple of days after the, ironically, a couple of days after the whole thing was over in the Daily Mail on a Monday morning. The cartoon illustrates both Kennedy and Khrushchev taking part in an arm wrestling match that neither side is likely to win. They're seating on missiles that could go off at any time. The cartoonist, that is, Illingworth, is trying to depict the unpredictability of a world as the crisis may lead to mutually assured destruction, known by its acronym MAD. So let's look at some of the ambivalent language. I remember listening to this when I was a young kid and thought, what does he mean by this? And I look at it now, and I'll let you read it and look at the words outlined there in red. Kennedy doesn't want a nuclear war. He knows, as he says later on in that particular sentence, the victory is ashes in our mouths. It's Pyrrhic. It's just not going to do any side any advantage at all. However, look what he says in the second line. But neither shall we shrink from that risk, which means in extremis, he would consider using nuclear weapons. Now, I ask you to think about today, because that's very much the language that the American administration under more Blinken than the president, thank goodness, is saying back to the Russians. He's saying, don't push us. We're not going to say what we're going to do, but don't push us. So this is the kind of ambivalent language that people use in nuclear saber rattling, if you will. A lot of analogies with what's going on now. Well, okay, special relationships. I've written a lot about the special relationships and how for many years it was quite an unspecial relationship between ourselves and the Americans. It was quite tense at times, and it was pretty good at this time. You can see our patrician leader there, almost an Edwardian grandee, if you like, Macmillan, and the young, quite attractive American to his side. Almost looks like a senior uncle with a son there, a nephew there. And that's very much what the relationship was like in the early 60s between Kennedy and Macmillan. He listened to Macmillan a lot about what would be done. That's not to say that he would do exactly what Macmillan said. Macmillan, by the way, was very reticent about this whole thing. He'd been in the First World War. He'd been in the trenches. He knew how destructive war was, and he was terrified of these nuclear weapons. Well, who wasn't if they had any sensible way of looking at it? I might say in these last 2 weeks the previous 2 weeks, while the crisis was really starting to boil away, several things happened. 600 academics wrote a joint letter, it was published in the press, regarding the folly of this potential catastrophe. The Labour opposition, Hugh Gaitskell was the leader of the opposition at the time, and in his cabinet, Harold Wilson and George Brown had a private meeting with Macmillan. Macmillan told them before anyone else knew what was going on how serious this all was. And their retort to this was basically, why are we getting involved? This is an American problem, very much most of their own making. Look at the Bay of Pigs. Look what happened there. They can deal with this. Why do we have to get involved? Well, it was getting tense on both sides. Macmillan didn't really know what to say back to them. This is an interesting point. He prorogued Parliament for the last 2 weeks of October. You might have heard that word recently. Well, when you look at the particular documents of the time, it was convenient to him because October is a classic month for party conferences and things of this nature. The Labour people wanted to have a full debate on the Cuba situation, but weren't allowed to do it. It almost came to violence within the chamber. It's interesting to note that. There were demonstrations outside the US Embassy in Grosvenor Square. CND, Committee of 100, Pat Arrowsmith and Wendy Butlin, as in the leisure place, basically, they decided it was so serious that they were going to emigrate to Western Ireland and sit out the entire crisis. Not a very good example of what was going to be left for the rest of the people. So there's a lot of tension behind, particularly in Britain, behind what was going on. They even had students at high schools going on strike, if there's such a thing, to say we can't accept this. And of course, there's nothing they could do either. So these are the sorts of things that's going on. Guy on the lower particular slide there, or sorry, the lower part of the slide, is a chap called David Ormsby Gore. He became eventually Lord Harlech, to any of you who know what he was and he was. He actually was a personal friend of Kennedy. Kennedy's father, Joe Kennedy, was the ambassador in London at the time, and they knew each other as much younger men. They got on very well, and it's discussed in quite a few papers that Ormsby Gore was a very, very wise person in giving good advice to Kennedy at these critical moments. Well, let's look at what the implications are for Britain. First of all, let me start at the top of that particular slide. A man called William Strath, senior Scottish civil servant, led to the preparation of a report on the effects of thermonuclear war on Britain. We have to remember that hydrogen bombs, thermonuclear bombs, were about 1,000 times more dangerous and more effective than the atomic bombs used at Nagasaki and Hiroshima. The Ivy Mike test, which was the first nuclear weapon loosed off, particularly by the Americans, a test shot, registered something greater than 15 megatons of explosive yield. This was enormous. In the way that the military talk about it, they said this was a revolutionary in military affairs. So this was something that had to be seriously addressed. By the way, Churchill was the person who instructed Strath to do this. He came back with a report that said 10 of the missiles, if they had a yield of 10 megaton, that's 100 megatons of yield, if you like, would destroy Britain's ability to function as a nation. The report went on to recommend that we build fallout shelters, which of course was at an inestimable cost, this in the 1950s, of billions. It just wasn't affordable at that time. So there are a lot of tension going on. But what did Britain have in its own favour? Well, first of all, it had the nuclear bombers, the V-Force, good examples, by the way, people just a few yards from where we're talking. The Anglo-American Thor missiles, there's an example of that in the museum, quite close to us as well. And not close to us were the US, USAF as they call themselves, Strategic Air Command bombers, that's the B-52s and B-47s, and the medium fighter bombers based in England. Undisclosed numbers of those things. We were making ourselves a target for the Soviet Union. They'd have to take us out before anything else happened. Well, look at what it looked like, and I'll get down to how serious this was at a time a bit later. I'm running ahead of the story here, but it's worth bringing up at this point. Those are pictures of the Thor missiles. Thor missiles were jointly administered by the United States and Britain through the RAF and the United States Air Force to be used on joint signals between both governments. So essentially, these were very effective missiles, 60 of these based in the UK. On the lower bit of the slide there is a quick reaction alert. These are what the Royal Air Force was trained to do with as few minutes as they might have to get their planes airborne. We'll talk a little bit about that when I get to the slide that is relevant. Well, it's also worth pointing out that you can see, in a sense, where Khrushchev was coming from. Khrushchev had a dacha, that's the other word that I wanted you to point out, over here near the Caucasus, in a place called Sochi. You'll know Sochi was part of the football tournament a few years ago. And he looked across there with his Politburo chums, and he said, do you know there are missiles based in Izmir in Turkey that are but 600 miles from my dacha, and I'm sure I'm being targeted. So you can see how you can empathize, not sympathize necessarily, but empathize with the situation that was developing. There, for your edification, are the radii of attack, if you like, as far as they can get from Thor missiles, Jupiter, and Turkey Jupiter. They're types of missiles, by the way, fairly old in that time even. Thors, there are 60 of those based in the eastern England area. Jupiters in southern Italy, there were about 40 of those in Italy and 15 in Turkey. So all in all, there was quite a lot of missile possibilities of what they call the IRBM, Intermediate Range Ballistic Missiles. Huge number of acronyms here, alphabet soup of numbers and figures and all the rest of it, but this is what really was going on. Well, we get to a time called Black Saturday, and this was really an issue that was definitely the most tense time, would have been yesterday, 60 years ago, if you will, that we ever had in the history of life as humans. And of course of what's going on at this point in the Cold War. So Khrushchev fires enough of his teletype messages, more of the parable narrative. He talks about a tug of war, and I'll quote it. A moment may come when that knot will be tied so tight that even he who ties it will not have the strength to move it. In that case, we will not know what to do. Consequently, if that is broken, there is no intention to tighten the knot. We doom the world to the catastrophe of thermonuclear war. Then let us not only relax the forces pulling on the ends of the rope, let us take measures to untie the knot. We are ready for this. He might have been ready for that, but nothing was coming out of Moscow, out of the Kremlin, to say what they were going to do. In other words, they weren't budging at all on how this looked. Let's look at what happened in the critical 2 days. They call it Black Saturday, the 27th of October, 1962. Things were happening between the two major superpowers that could have easily sparked a thermonuclear war. First of all, a U-2 on a routine, if there's such a thing as a routine flight from U-2, over the North Pole. Why was it going to do this? It was sampling isotopes of nuclear weapons that had been set off in Novaya Zemlya in the Russian Arctic islands a few days before. And what this particular U-2 was looking to do was to capture at high altitude, and they go at high altitude, these particular isotopes from a fallout, if you like, of the weapon to find out they can get characteristics of those weapons. It strayed into Russian airspace. And it strayed seriously into eastern Siberia without even knowing it. It finally was recovered mainly because American Air Force jets came out to rescue it, even though it was being chased by MiG fighters at the time. That's how close it was. The second thing, and there are several more than this, I could go on. This was more serious, and that wasn't bad enough. Another U-2 was doing an overflight over Cuba, which they'd done many of over the past few weeks, was shot down by a Soviet surface-to-air guideline missile over Cuba. Why did that happen? The line of control was not being obeyed. The Russian colonel that loosed off those missiles, that let them fire them, did not have the authorization from Moscow to do that. He did it on his own volition. Fortunately, when Kennedy got to hear about it, he decided to keep the powder dry. It could have easily sparked some kind of huge reaction, a nuclear one as well as a conventional one. Never mind the fact that the vessels that were coming towards Cuba, most of them had turned back and didn't want to be boarded by Americans, United States Navy people. This became an issue for the Americans because 4 or 5 submarines of the Russian variety Soviet variety, were actually coming towards the line and looking to break that line of control that they had in the area. The Americans, these Foxtrot submarines were diesel-electric submarines. They were very easy for the US Navy to detect on their acoustic sonars and all the rest of it. And they found this particular one close to the Sargasso Sea in the east part of the, not of the Caribbean, of the eastern part of the South Atlantic or the Middle Atlantic off Cuba, off Florida. And they released depth charges to try and bring that particular vessel to the surface. These vessels had been submerged for days. The temperature on the vessel, on the submarine, was about 60 degrees Celsius, and the carbon dioxide level was very, very high. The judgment call of these people was pretty low. They had, amongst their ordnance, 1 nuclear torpedo, which they could use if they felt it was appropriate and for which they got approval. They didn't know what to do. They wondered if they should surface and either surrender to the Americans or alternatively activate the nuclear torpedo and fire at the USS Essex, a huge aircraft carrier in the area. This particular nuclear torpedo had the ordnance value of about the same as a Hiroshima bomb. So had it hit the Essex, the USS Essex, that surely would have been one of the worst things to have ever happened. So the senior people on that particular submarine, had an argument. And basically, a man called Okhipov decided to tell them that this was idiotic. Let us just surface and see what's happening, and we'll radio Moscow and see what we should be doing. They did. Unfortunately, that particular nuclear torpedo was not put into action or into the tubes to fire. Had it done so, and it could have easily happened, it would have been a very, very different outcome, counterfactually. So the fourth thing that happened, was the US forces were preparing to invade Cuba within 48 hours. It didn't take a genius to know if there were 100,000 troops ready to man barges and ships, that it was going to be a D-Day operation. And it would have been had it happened. So the obviousness of the ultimatum that was really coming down the line was there and there for everyone to see. Finally, although it said that people at Guantanamo knew this was happening, the Soviets were moving into position with tactical nuclear weapons, cruise missiles, which I talked about earlier in the discussion. And you can see how serious this would have been had they loosed off those particular cruise missiles. Again, they had the kiloton range in the nature or in the range of what was happening in Cuba in Hiroshima at the end of the Second World War. So all of this really comes back to what we were really doing in Britain. Now, my surname's Pyke. Not a namesake of this particular person here. His spelling is slightly different. Tom Pyke was the RAF Chief of the Air Staff, the CAS, if you like, at the time. And he met Macmillan at Admiralty House. They were doing up Downing Street at that time. And so they were having all their discussions and meetings at the Admiralty House. They decided, and Pyke told Macmillan that his recommendation was to place the V-bombers on Alert Condition 3. Alert Condition 3 means that you load all of your capable V-bombers with yellow sun nuclear weapons ready to use at 15 minutes notice. A range of Bomber Command's aircraft at airfields, mainly in principally in Eastern England, were on that kind of alert from 1 p.m. on that day, on the 27th of October, right the way through, even into November, even after the Cuban crisis was over. So these particular airmen, aircrew, what did they do? First of all, they couldn't leave the station, in their RAF stations. Second of all, they couldn't really tell their wives what was going on. And third, blissfully unaware, most of the British public, many of us in this room were probably around, or not many, but some of us were around at that time, were blissfully unaware that this crisis was really enveloping well beyond what we'd been told was happening. Most of us who listened to the radio thought when the missiles turned back mid-ocean, the ones that were coming to build up the nuclear weapons that they were putting on the island, we thought, oh, we've finally reached a point where we can all relax. Let's go and watch football on Sunday afternoon. In the midst of all of this, at High Wycombe, which was the centre for Bomber Command, and the airfields that it administered, were on the highest alert that they had been through in the Cold War. Now, fortunately, they'd all been on practice doing something exactly like this a month before. So they knew what to expect and what to know. They didn't really know if this was going to be real or not. But it was a very tense time. They'd been watching the news, listening to the news. These are the RAF crews, and they knew what might happen if this particular balloon went up. So consequently, Bing Cross, who was the commander-in-chief, C&C, of the Bomber Command at that time, put his particular things on, his particular V-bombers on complete alert, together with the Thor missiles that I'd talked about previously. So this was a serious escalation of the whole situation. Macmillan was a very educated man. And earlier that year, he'd read a book which was a Pulitzer Prize winner. I have to look at it again because I keep forgetting the name of it. But it was about August War in 1914. It was called The Guns of August, and it was by a lady called Barbara Tuchman. And her thesis basically is the First World War more or less happened by mistake, or misunderstanding rather. Someone gets shot in Sarajevo, and suddenly the belligerents propel themselves in a way that they wouldn't have chosen otherwise to become belligerents between each other. Russia against Germany, Austria obviously being involved in that, France and Britain having an alliance, triple alliance with Russia, and suddenly the whole thing slid into a cataclysm of what happened in the First World War. Macmillan, to his great benefit, was very aware of that. And he'd mentioned a few days previously to a guy called General Norstad, who was the NATO commander in Western Europe. He said, please do not make any obvious moves that we are mobilizing towards war. Many wars are started by just mobilizing towards war. Let us avoid that particular trap. Very wise. And in fact, the RAF, very much took that as what they should be doing. They went about their business. No one really knew what was happening at the airfields. None of the aircraft took off to go to so-called dispersal airfields, which would have meant mobilization, dispersal of the fields, and more serious things. So the whole thing was starting to spin out of control, mainly because the Americans themselves had redesigned the thing to Defense Condition 2, which is just 1 point away from a nuclear war starting. So it was always coming to a particular serious pass. And I admire that Macmillan said, just keep our powder dry. Just do all the things that you need to do, quietly launch, put the bombs in the aircraft, have your people ready. And they were ready. Quick reaction alert, getting these jets to take off at very, very short notice was a major achievement, getting all 4 of the big Olympus engines on a Vulcan, for instance, all to fire at once so that that aircraft could start rolling, get to its dispersal airfield, or go straight towards targets as designated by those particular situations. I've spoken to some of these air crew, some of them are much older than me, believe it or not, and you know, they said, they looked at their wives and said, look, if you see the aircraft taking off, get the kids in the car and go up to the northwest of England and get out of here as soon as possible, knowing that their air bases were probably under threat of nuclear attack by the Soviets. It got that close. But playing the hand carefully was very important. Another thing that was decided that day at that lunchtime meeting on the 27th was basically, if we don't hear that the Russians or the Soviets, I'm sorry to keep talking that the Soviets have not acquiesced on moving their weapons, we shall move to the war book requirements. Let me describe just briefly in these last few minutes what the war book requirements were. This meant that in case of a crisis that might lead to nuclear war, the command and control that's necessary in Britain, in the United Kingdom, had to be administered from shelters, from safe shelters, particularly away from the City of London. And this was something that would have been put into effect, but it wasn't, thank goodness. So I'm going to talk counterfactually now about what might have happened, and thank goodness it didn't, as a result of those particular movements. Remembering all the time that everyone knew the ultimatum was there. What was the ultimatum? Basically, the Americans were going to invade Cuba. Finish and done. That was going to happen. Irregardless of all the consequences of that, that was up for going on. There was nothing that would stop that. If Kennedy had not heard from Khrushchev, that was the end of the story. So, thank goodness there was that reticence, and that was the real problem. Well, I don't want to kind of disturb people with this. There's an outfit called Sandia. Sandia is an outfit that does catastrophic analyses of what happens when nuclear weapons attack various things. You can get this online, by the way. It's a morbid thing to get, and I don't suggest that you do. And of course, it didn't happen. But years later, a guy called Sir John Hackett, General Sir John Hackett, anyone heard of him? But anyway, he wrote a book called Third World War, August 1985. Excuse me, let's start again. Third World War, August 1985. It was published, by the way, in 1978. A nuclear strike on Birmingham, and he addresses this in quite gruesome detail of what might happen. And of course, let me look at the map. I don't know this part of the West Midlands very well, but we're just off the map there, places like Cosford. That's fairly close to us here. You could see the diameter of an airburst at 8,000 feet above the bull ring in central Birmingham would have vaporized everything within 5 square kilometers. And beyond that, there would have been blast and heat that would have gone on with all those morbid statistics that you can see on the left-hand side of the slide. A 2.3 megaton bomb, of course, in that medium-range Sandal missile that we talked about earlier. And this is the sort of stuff that we'd be looking at. Damage area would have been huge, and the damage, of course, to the West Midlands would have been exceptionally bad. This is the sort of thing that people were very reticent about and continue to be reticent about. Sorry, going the wrong way. So let's look at what was going on at that time. First of all, on the map on the left-hand side of the slide, we've got these, what they call regional seats of government, where central government would have dispersed the operation of what was happening in the UK to these devolved areas that are up on the screen there. To the right-hand side is a seat of government It was built slightly after Cuba, so I'm rather pushing the envelope here. It's in Northern Ireland. By the way, it's for sale for about £500,000. I don't know why any of you would want to buy it. Maybe it'd be good as a wine cellar. But other than that, I can't think what on earth you'd do with it. But anyway, there it is. All it looks like is an inconspicuous area that could even be a water supply area or whatever, water reservoir. So there were the ones that really mattered, the most important of which was here near Bath in Wiltshire, not in Somerset, just across the border here, just off the A4, Spring Quarry, Box Hill, which is a very attractive area full of oolitic limestone and had been quarried for years through the years of the Second World War. To the adjacent area of the quarry was an area of, let me show on the next slide, was an area that had 40 acres underground, which would have been the central seat of government for the United Kingdom should the worst ever have happened. This is Armageddon +1, if you like. The Deputy Prime Minister, several other people would have gone there together with 3,000 or 4,000 civil servants and military personnel to live there until the crisis was over. And equivalently, if we go back to the other slide, others would have gone to other parts as regional controllers of what would have happened. This is the stuff of the war game, if any one of you ever watched it, would have happened in a counterfactual world where this might have happened. To their great value, to their great respect, Macmillan kept the powder dry and basically didn't move on any of these things. Well, it did end, thank goodness. And Schlesinger, who was a press officer at the time in the Kennedy administration, quite rightly said it was a dangerous moment in the course of human history. What's interesting, though, as a historian, is to realize I had lived through it, but I didn't realize what was really going on. And the end of the Cold War represented a time when Russians, post-Soviet times, could make their files available to historians on both sides of the equation and vice versa to really examine what happened. First of all, Kennedy was obsessed with the fact that Berlin would be part of the equation that might be agreed between himself and Khrushchev. And he knew if he did that, he'd be throwing away bargaining chips. That was never the case. Khrushchev had no interest in doing anything in Berlin. This was about Che Guevara, it was about the Castros, it was about getting communists recognized within the Western Hemisphere. So that was a huge misunderstanding. Second thing, Khrushchev very much misunderstood Kennedy. Kennedy was quite an educated man, and yes, he had seen military experience in the round. So there were misunderstandings there that we ought to be very careful of when we look at those sorts of things. And we see that now, misunderstandings from both sides. So I just want to really put 2 or 3 slides on, and then we can open the floor for Q&As. It was a very compressed timescale. You look at the timescale we have now with the Ukrainian war, as distinct from these very dangerous 2 weeks. An awful lot was happening at once. Very, very dangerous time, very, very dangerous experiences. And of course, in the middle of which, Gromyko, who was the foreign minister for the Russians, for the Soviets, saying categorically in the White House, no, we don't have offensive missiles there. Yes, they did. And even at that time, Kennedy had photographs in his drawer just adjacent to where he was talking to Gromyko in his own office. So we get to this critical point on Black Saturday where a lot of bad things might have happened. If Arkhipov had not told his colleagues on that submarine, God knows where this would have ended. So, learning outcomes and all the rest of it. Clearly, I don't have to say anything more than what's on the slide there. You know, a lot was written. Robert Kennedy wrote a book about it, but always through the prism of what Robert Kennedy felt it was like for him, rather than what other people felt it was like. The biggest question I have is the 4th, 5th bullet down there, 4th bullet. did nuclear deterrence actually deter? I'm minded to think it did, but only just. McNamara, Defense Secretary for the United States at the time, thought, no, we were just lucky. So there's an interesting discussion there that we could have, not necessarily here, but a discourse that continues to go on about deterrence. The danger of war by miscalculation is the one thing I would leave you with. So where do we come out on all of this, if it means anything, in terms of learning from Cuba for future situations? First of all, to paraphrase Sun Tzu, who either did or didn't exist as a Chinese warrior philosopher, know your enemy. In other words, you don't have to like him, but you need to know how he ticks, or he or she, obviously. Nuclear deterrence depends on rational actors. Really? Look at this third bullet. Well, some of them were far from rational. Kurt LeMay was not rational. There's no doubt about that. Neither was Castro. I haven't mentioned, but Castro wanted to loose off offensive nuclear weapons in any event, irregardless of what was happening, knowing that he'd be killed in a nuclear war as a result of it. Well, compressed timescale, as we've mentioned. What really happened? Well, I have to say things got better after this, and thank God they did. A hotline, would you believe, there was no way the president could talk to the chairman of the Politburo by phone. There's a little bit of an interesting, just in conclusion, story here. What's his name? Khrushchev had a beautiful dacha in the Lenin Hills in the suburbs of Moscow. So he got the Politburo to come to his place on Saturday night and he said, look, we've got to do something about this. Can we agree that we'll send them a communique that they can react to as fast as possible? Politburo looked back at Khrushchev and said, the worst may happen in the interim. He said, well, what can we do? Well, he said, let's put something on Radio Moscow. Famous reader there, well-known character who read the news every night, very much like we have here, would read the news out that the Soviet Union will accept the requirements of getting the missiles out of Cuba. So how was this going to happen? Well, a courier was brought into the room. They gave him the communique to be read out on Radio Moscow that night. And so he did. So he got in his car and got lost in a traffic jam. Worse still, when he finally got to the Radio Moscow office, and by the way, it was Sunday by this time, Sunday early their time, he got into the lift and the lift got stuck. It was one of those old-fashioned lifts which had the cage-type stuff up it, and the lift had just stopped between floors together with the courier with the note. They finally got it going, and goodness knows, it actually got read. And that's why the Americans, and for that matter anyone else in the world, knew that the Soviets were relenting on this particular issue. Fast though that was, though, it does show, this comes from a story by Peter Hennessy, now Lord Hennessy, who wrote about this. It shows how close we were to the edge on the business of Armageddon. Just in final things, Macmillan never really got over this. His grandson, Viscount Stockton, still alive, he said Harold Macmillan had repeated nightmares about two things before he died. One was what would have happened if it went to a full nuclear exchange, and number two was how dreadful his experience was in World War I in the trenches. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll be happy to take it.
Thank you, Bill, for that fascinating talk. Got time now for a few questions. I'll take some from the floor, but also on Crowdcast. So anybody who's joining online, please get them into the Q&A function. So I'll start with the floor first. Anybody got any questions?
Thank you for such a fascinating talk.
Thank you.
Two questions. I have read that Kennedy was pressurising Macmillan to disperse the V-Force to the 26 dispersal airfields.
Yeah.
And Macmillan said, no, that is an obvious sign of raising tension. As
Mobilisation.
you
Yeah.
said. But is it true that instead of deploying them, he brought the Thors to 15 minutes readiness as a kind of
A compromise, if you like, yeah.
It was not threatening in the same way that dispersing the V-Force was.
Yeah, no, well, first of all, I'm not sure. You may well be right that I've never seen anything written to say that Kennedy had addressed that particular situation. Suffice it to say that the Thors were brought up at the same moment as the V-Force was brought up to 15-minute readiness. 59 of the 60 Thor missiles were ready to go. They were liquid fueled, so they had to be put into such a condition. The issue is if they were starting to be raised, that would have been an indication they were ready to go. So they were fueled horizontally with a situation to go within that.
Thank you. And the second question is the stories came out later were that there was a secret deal that America would take the missiles out of Italy and Turkey as part of Khrushchev.
That's absolutely true. The farce was, and this is why it is a farce, the Jupiter missiles, the Jupiter-C missiles in Turkey particularly, were junk. Basically, they didn't work that well. And they were going to be removed anyway in April of the following year. But for a loss of faith, Kennedy says, can you keep that quiet? I've got the midterms coming up. So that bit is true. BBC got that right. I remember hearing it as a schoolboy, that there was a quid pro quo arrangement. So they speculated on it, but officially it wasn't agreed, and the Russians kept their part of the bargain by keeping that quiet, at least during that time anyway.
Thank you, sir. One comment before I ask my question. In regards to Macmillan, I read, it might have been anecdotal, but I read when I was reading about the history of the Vulcan, the written history, that Kennedy approached Macmillan and asked him to put the whole V-bomber force on a war footing. And Macmillan's reply was supposed to be typical British understatement. He thought that was a bit provocative.
Yeah, well, that could well have happened. I mean, there are extensive phone calls. I have to say that Macmillan and Kennedy had a lot of discussions over the 2-week period, some of which we'll never know about. But that could well be true. I wouldn't deny that in a minute.
I mean, my father was stationed at RAF Waddington during the crisis.
One of the key places then.
That was a key base. Now, my question, sir, is would you agree the Americans never took into consideration the acknowledged paranoia that the Soviets had after the Second World War in regards to the fact that missiles, intermediate range missiles, were based in Turkey and which could easily reach the Russian border, but the Russians had no counter attack to this, and that's why they, all right, for whatever reason, they tried to get missiles based in Cuba to counteract that.
There is a logic to that, a very real logic to it. There are two answers I'll give to you. One, or at least part of the same. The first thing was American observers, those who are erudite enough to write about this, said, we have the luxury of having 2 oceans between us and our adversaries. The Russians didn't. And they'd had encirclement for several periods of their history, most notably with Napoleon initially, but also with others, and of course with what happened after the invasion of the whole of the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa in 1941. So they had very realistic fears, and they were fears, and they said the only way we can counteract that is to have a strong nuclear force as a counterbalance, a balance of terror, if you will. I think that's what's missing in the equation. A few months after the whole thing calmed down, there were Russian submarines very close off Nova Scotia and anywhere else for that matter in the Pacific that could have wreaked as much damage as those particular missiles in Cuba. But it was not a very smart move by Khrushchev. He just frightened people and knocked them off balance. And he was deceptive. That was the thing.
as they say, hindsight is 20/20 vision.
Yes, all history is. All history.
Thank you for an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Can you say a little bit more about how the deal came about to remove the missiles from Turkey in exchange for obviously the missiles from Cuba being removed?
Yeah, I think first of all there were, they call it off-ramping now, but it was about back channels. And one of the back channels was Robert Kennedy, that's Kennedy's brother, if you will, he was the Attorney General, quietly went around to talk to the Russian Soviet ambassador and said, look, we would not want this published or publicized, but my brother would be keen on getting rid of these particular Turkish missiles. I'm not even sure about the Italian ones, but the Turkish missiles, which were upsetting Khrushchev more than anything else, but it would have to be kept quiet. Those particular discussions happened a day before the final agreement that came across on Radio Moscow. So that was already in the mix. It was a question of the Americans not wanting to look to cave in to Russian demands based on a quid pro quo. It all seems a bit silly looking back. They could have said, well, we're moving out anyway, so why don't you get rid of yours? But they didn't. Okay. Okay, cheers.
Thank you. I'm intrigued as to how the Americans managed to have a naval base on Cuba.
It was an historic vestige, and I beg ignorance about the Spanish-American thing and all the rest of it, but it was something that goes back in history, I think, to the time of Teddy Roosevelt, if I'm not mistaken, and that was a prerequisite. And because they had it and it was well armed, it would have been an idiotic thing for them to try and attack it, and they meaning Che Guevara and folk, Castro and folk, doing anything about that. So they had to live with it, as they still do. Guantanamo is still in operation.
And just finally, it's just a comment really. There was a film made not that long ago, a few years ago, about the businessman Greville Wynne and Pentovsky, and how that all came about. Obviously, it was a dramatisation. I enjoyed it, but I don't know how much of it was true and how much was...
Most of it was. It was Ben Cumberbatch was the role of Greville Wynne. That's the businessman, the British businessman that was involved in this whole thing. And most of it's true. Oleg Penkovsky wanted to be an MI6 operative and was accepted as such. The CIA thought he was nuts. But the MI6 people saw something in it. Not only could he provide information, which he did on the missiles, huge numbers of it, which comes out in the film. By the way, I've watched the film. It was all true. My mother, I remember saying, they've just arrested a British businessman in Moscow. I said, well, there must be something in it. They don't just randomly arrest British business. This was at the time of before Cuba, 1961. And I said, Mother, I think there is something going on here. Even a 15-year-old can see that. But clearly there was. Sadly, Penkovsky was arrested just about the time of Cuba and was shot the year later. He was a colonel in the GRU.
What was that film called? Because I can't remember.
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know either. Because it's
an excellent
it's
portrayal.
A good thing to watch.
But it is fairly close to the truth. Dies in Lubyanka prison, yeah.
Thank you. The Courier.
The Courier. Well done, you.
Just a small point of interest, perhaps. You mentioned the local areas for government.
Yeah.
And there's one actually within an hour's drive of here.
Is it Kidderminster?
No, Hack Green.
Oh, yes, it's up in Cheshire, isn't it?
Which is open to the public, in fact.
Yes, it is,
There's
yes.
a cost of £7 to get in or thereabouts.
Okay,
yeah.
You've been there, I take it.
I have several times,
Okay,
yes. Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll take some questions from Crowdcast then. What were the French doing during all of this?
The French had just developed a nuclear weapon. They weren't as much a force as we are. They were developing what they call the force de frappe, which is a force of hitting, but it was nowhere as near developed as the V-force at that time. They were also semi-detached from the whole NATO structure as much as anything else. But Kennedy, to his credit, sent Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, to talk to Adenauer and to de Gaulle about the situation. They were supportive of what was going on. So the French were very supportive of the resistance shown to anything to do with Cuba. It wasn't as if they were ambivalent. They got off the fence on that one. Hope that answers the question. Yeah.
And a question about how much real-time intelligence the Americans had. Were they able to fly U-2s around the clock over Cuba during the time of the emergency?
No, they weren't. No, and I think now you've got real-time everything. You know, what happens now is what we can see on satellites, on what planes can beam back to main base. They can see the pictures, the visuals, digital images of what they're seeing. That wasn't available. It was very much an analog world we were living in 1962.
Do you know if the warheads arrived in Cuba at the same time as the missiles?
Not completely, no. No, they didn't. They arrived on separate boats and had to be connected, if you like, or mated, they call it mating, with the missiles. But it was done at a terrific pace, as much as anything else. There are numerous books, and films for that matter, about Cuba. I wanted to put a spin on it to say, well, what does it mean for all of us here? You know, what was the threat to us? What were we going to do? And the interesting thing is that we were enmeshed in something we really couldn't get out of, even if we wanted to, because of this special relationship of the American-British forces.
And a question, sorry, Bill.
Go on.
A question about the V-bombers. Is it true that some of them, with the further away targets, would not have had enough fuel to return to their home bases, or indeed anywhere in the UK?
Pass. I really don't know. Some of them, I mean, if you speak to different people and they said, well, keep flying on till Mongolia and find a good girl there that you can, you know. Others say other things, that they would try to get back to what? A ruined airfield with their people dead, their family dead? I don't know. It's gone into counterfactuals really here. We just don't know.
Any more questions from the floor at all? Yeah.
What's your favourite book on the subject?
It's one called One Hell of a Gamble, and it's by a Russian and an American. They wrote it jointly, and it was published in, if I'm not wrong, 1997. Natlafi, One Hell of a Gamble, you'll get it. And that was a phrase that was used by Kennedy on the basis of what was being discussed in the ExComm, in the Executive Committee. One Hell of a Gamble is definitely the most authoritative book I've ever seen, and it takes into account all the post-Cold War memorabilia on both sides of the equation. So it's objective in that sense. Okay.
In your presentation, you make no reference to Project E weapons.
Project Emily? No, I didn't. Project Emily was definitely something that loaded up American bombs on British bombers, basically, at a time when we didn't have enough nuclear weapons of our own. And I haven't mentioned the details of what all the V-Force was doing. The Valiants, the ones that were in Marham, I think. Were you at Marham? But yeah, they were definitely part of SACEUR. In other words, they were Strategic Air Command Europe. And they would have been under the control of Norstad and Folk with regards to presumably different targets to the strategic targets that the Bomber Command had in other areas. But they were the Valiants, weren't they?
Not all were Valiant.
Okay.
Honington was Project E
Yeah.
base, and they also had
Yeah.
the US weapons. Marham was the same.
Yeah. Okay. The British used the Yellow Sun. Well, it was a Yellow Sun bomb case with a red beard warhead in it. In terms of if you know the stuff.
YS1 or YS2?
What's that?
Yellow Sun Mark 1 or Mark 2?
Yeah, I don't know which one it was.
2 was a thermonuclear weapon with a re-engineered American warhead.
Okay.
Whereas the YS1 was a British weapon with a British warhead.
Yeah. I suppose. Yeah.
Project Emily was the Thor program.
Well, they kind of evolved at more or less the same pace, really. This started to be. We have to realise that in that period of the Cold War, the Americans shut us out of anything to do with nuclear secrets for quite a number of years, any time from 1946 to essentially 1957. So you had 11 years where we couldn't even discourse with the Americans. We made our own nuclear weapon based on people who had been at Los Alamos in the Manhattan Project, who had the knowledge. One of them, called Penny, was key to that, and he basically, amongst others, got the British nuclear weapon developed. But Emily and all the other projects that came as a result of the discourse that came together in 1958, particularly when Macmillan met Eisenhower, and there was a real, what I call, improvement of relationships, an opening up of sharing nuclear secrets. At the same moment, we didn't have enough nuclear weapons of our own. So the issue became, well, we can help you along with that. We'll give you the launch gear and all the rest of it. We will store the bombs, but provide them to you in times of emergency. Yeah? So Emily, or Project E, really evolved out of that. Concurrently with that, there was an agreement on having these Thor missiles based in eastern England as a stopgap measure before the Americans got the intercontinental ballistic missiles in shape. They had the Minuteman, a solid fuel rocket, but it was still in its infancy. They just didn't have the strength actually to have that. It's worth bearing in mind that all of those things were disbanded or taken away by 1963, late 1963. All of it had gone. The Jupiters and the Jupiters, sorry, did I say the Jupiters and the Thors were all disbanded and dismembered and taken back to the United States, mostly as junk. And then the Americans just depended on the Polaris fleet and, of course, the updated Minutemen and all the rest of the thing, plus the SA bombers, SAC bombers. They see that as their triad of strength. Hope that answers your question. Okay.
I think we're going to have to call it a day there, but I'd like to. No, thank you very much for coming, and
thank you for coming.
I'd like everyone to join me in thanking Bill for a really fascinating talk.
Thank you.